Hello, this is Lee Thurburn, and I want to thank you for watching this episode of Livestream Lee. Today I'm going to be talking about China and Taiwan and what I believe is a very serious and near-term problem that's going to arise, which is going to be a war between Taiwan and China. So I'm going to take this opportunity to explain my reasoning for why I think that's coming in the next couple of years. First of all, I'd like to say thank you. And if you enjoy this video, I would really appreciate it if you would like it, subscribe to my channel, and ring the bell, which apparently means something to YouTube, as well as leave a comment of some sort. Let me know. If you agree, great, tell me why. If you disagree, also great, tell me why. I'm very interested in hearing your feedback. There is, in modern Western thought, especially in the liberal side of the world, a perception that humanity has evolved past having wars. And there seem to be a lot of people that were really quite surprised when Putin invaded the Ukraine. There were actually, I remember, a lot of people, politicians, diplomats, leading sort of global thinkers, generals, almost all of which expressed a high level of skepticism back in the late part of 2021 and the first couple of months of 2022. They expressed a lot of skepticism that Russia would actually invade Ukraine. And of course, yet they did. There is currently a similar level of disbelief regarding the probability of China attacking Taiwan. Many people say that that'll never happen. After all, war just doesn't seem to make sense in this economically globalized world of the 21st century. But wars are fought for a lot of reasons, including economic reasons, territorial reasons, religious, nationalism, ideological, civil, revolution, revenge. Leaders have egos that cause them to engage in wars, and then nations engage in wars either as a defense against an attack or as a preemptive defense. So all of these things can contribute, or any combination of them can contribute, and often do. Wars are never really simple things. They have complex reasons for starting. It's safe to say that no rational person would want a war. However, throughout all of history, wars have been a recurring plague on humanity. I'm going to move this little guy over a little bit so that he's easy to see. The fact is, nations routinely decide to wage war, and the next major conflict looks like it'll be China trying to reunify Taiwan with the mainland economy and the mainland people. So the question is really not if China will try to retake Taiwan, because they've been very clear about it for decades, that they are going to reunify. There's no doubt in China's mind that they're going to reunify the island with the mainland. So the question isn't if, but rather when and how it will happen. Well, the question of how is a much more complex military strategy issue that I'm not really qualified or prepared to address in the scope of this video. But a few simple things are known. That is, China has a navy of between 350 and 600 ships. Most of them are fairly small, at least in comparison to the U.S. Sixth Fleet and the navy that the United States fields. The United States has a navy of between 290 and 490 ships, depending upon, again, how you want to count the ships. And at any given point in time, many of them are in dry dock undergoing repairs and maintenance. Plus, our ability to field a force in the Western Pacific at any given point in time is something less than the total number of ships that we have. So there's really a distinct numerical advantage that China has to the United States as an ally trying to help Taiwan. So I'm going to focus on the why and the when as opposed to the how. So let's start with these questions. What could China either gain or lose if and when they decide to attack? Start with the lose. What could or would China risk by attacking Taiwan? Well, of course, they could fail. And if they did, that would be a serious setback. And they probably, the CCP, the Communist Chinese Party, would probably suffer a regime change if they engaged in a war and they lost. Now, they will pay a price of some sort, either large or small, in both blood and treasure. War never comes cheap. They will, without a doubt, suffer economically from a variety of boycotts and embargoes and blockades. Those kinds of things are going to happen. You saw it in the place when Russia invaded Ukraine. They will suffer immense reputational damage in the Western world, and they will unite their enemies into a powerful coalition against them. They will alienate the Taiwanese people even more than they already have, and they will destroy much of Taiwan's infrastructure and industrial base. So they're also, and this is the big one to United States citizens, they're going to risk a conflict with the United States that could turn nuclear, and nobody wants to see that. So on the flip side, what could China potentially gain by attacking Taiwan? Well, now, if they win, they get Taiwan, and their goal of reunification is achieved, and that gives them tremendous stature both inside their country as well as on the world stage. It'd be a big boost to them. If they win, they gain increased influence in global military matters, and if they win, they increase their population and their industrial capacity. Now, whether they win or lose, they're going to distract their population from the economic troubles that they have at home. And China has a lot of economic troubles that they'd like to distract their population from. If they fail to win, and maybe it becomes a draw, something in that range, it's not an outright lose, but they don't win. And as a result of that, the United States presence in the Western Pacific is minimized or reduced, then they likely are going to gain some regional influence relative to the United States, at least temporarily. So when will China attack Taiwan? Let's presume that they do that in the next 2 years. So there are some questions related to this that we want to answer. Why would they attack within 2 years? Will other countries support them? How might China attack Taiwan? I'm going to dig a little deeper into it, but not real deep. Will an attack lead to a nuclear exchange? When China attacks, what will be the impact on world trade? The next question is, let's presume that China doesn't attack for at least 2 years. In that case, does China expand or decline economically? Does China's sphere of influence continue to expand? Does China ever get a handle on its economic troubles? Can China change the trend towards population demographic collapse? When does a demographic collapse actually impact China's global stature? And if China were to start shrinking, how would that happen, and what would happen to the Communist Chinese Party? I'm going to go through a set of foundational assumptions, and many of these actually deal directly with the logic that I have for why an attack probability is much greater than many people think. We're going to talk about demographic challenges, population. We're going to talk about housing and financial challenges, resource challenges, economic challenges, and military challenges. Now, in the realm of demographic challenges, it basically boils down to China doesn't have enough population in their upcoming generations. You can look at this population tree to the right, And you can see that whereas the ideal situation would be a very wide base and a narrow top, the reality is China has a very thick middle and a narrow base. Now, what you're looking at are rows of 5-year age increments, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, and so on. And it shows the number of people in terms of millions that are in each one. But what's important to note is that there are essentially 4 cohorts in this that you don't see lined out. The first 3 rows are children. Up to the age of 14, children are not able to contribute financially. Sometime between 15 and 20, they start to be able to contribute. So your first 3 or 4 rows are really just, they don't do anything in the economy except consume. Now, starting in somewhere between 15 and 20 years old up to about 25 or 30, about another 15-year range, you have young producers that are just entering the workforce. They haven't accumulated any wealth or capital, and they are wanting things. And so these are people that borrow. These are the people that go into debt to get things like cars and motorcycles and apartments and houses and all the other things of life that young people want. Then the next group is the 25 or 30 through 65 or through 55 or 60 range. This is the thick bulk in the middle, and these are your producers. These are the people that are your most productive members of society. They have the most skills, they've got the most experience, they produce at a really great rate. And that's important because that's what made China powerful. Over the last 40 years, these people are that's the bulk of what were 40 years ago children, and now they're in their 40s and 50s and 60s. And pretty soon they're going to enter the last cohort, which is 60 plus. And those are people that are either in retirement or near retirement, and their hallmark is that they are accumulating wealth. They have more wealth than the rest of the population, and they are not consuming as much as the rest of the population. And many of these people need financial support in their retirement years. That's either going to come from the government or from family members, and so they're draining the capital of the and the resources of the country. Now, why is this important? Well, the middle population is extremely large. In the next 20 to 40 years is going to age into the retirement years. They're not going to be producers any longer. And what you see coming along below is the next generation of producers. And there are not going to be enough of them to support the top-heavy population. And even more important is fertility rates and population replenishment rates. So the fertility rate in China is 1.7 children per childbearing woman, which is 20 to 40 years old. So there's a 20-year batch of women that are bearing children, and they're bearing children at the rate of less than them and a husband. Now, what that means is the next generation is going to be smaller than the current generation, and generally speaking, there's not a replenishment wave of children coming along. This population distribution tree looks almost exactly identical to what Japan's was 30 to 40 years ago. Now, Japan is in population decline. Their fertility rate is 1.36. They're losing about 0.5% of their population per year, and that adds up over time. And so it's important to understand that China just doesn't have enough women to be able to repopulate their country. That's a massively fundamental problem for the future of China. Now, from a housing and financial challenges perspective, China's financial system is really pretty unstable. While they do have an income tax on their population, and it's a graduated income tax, very similar in some respects to what the United States has, they don't have any property taxes. And that's a big deal. Property taxes in the United States support local governments. They support things like police forces and fire departments and social services and parks and recreation and all the kinds of things that make life in America really wonderful. Well, in China, they don't have property taxes because all of the land is owned by the state. And the states can't collect income tax or property tax, so the states have no real way of financing themselves except and unless the federal part of the system, if you can call it that, the overall Chinese Communist Party government, gives them money, which generally speaking doesn't happen very much. So because of that, the only way that the states and the cities can support themselves is to sell off land to developers who then build apartment complexes and pay fees to the state. And they sell the apartment complexes, the condominium complexes, to people that are buying homes. Well, the problem is people are buying more homes than they need. Real estate is the only realistic option for wealth creation for the people of China. Because China doesn't have a property ownership system where people can own property, that actually has ramifications in the stock market as well. Companies that are listed, that are publicly traded in China, are almost a sham because the Chinese Communist Party at any moment in time can go into the stock market and can delist. It can impose severe economic sanctions on these companies. The concept of property ownership and stock as property is very tenuous in China. And the Chinese people know this. And so when they have spare money, they buy real estate with it. They buy real estate for a whole lot of reasons, but it boils down to, of all of the properties currently being sold, first of all, there's 55 million more properties owned than there are people or families to live in them. People have way over purchased properties, meaning that people are not buying first homes really anymore. They're buying second homes and third homes. Third homes account for almost 20%, 18% of the properties currently being sold in China. Now, the most recent data is not readily available. However, it's well known now that Chinese properties are in an immense bubble. And the collapse has already begun. There are bank runs, there are mortgage moratoriums happening, there's rioting and dissent and public demonstrations outside of banks by bank holders who want to get their money, but the banks aren't giving out their money. This whole system is very tenuous at best. And last but not least, there is little or no consumerism in China. The Chinese people do not buy things like people in the West are doing. This is a big deal. It really impacts the economic challenges we'll get to in just a second. From a resource challenges perspective, the natural resources that countries have a tremendous influence on their ability to compete in the world. The single most important resource that China has an insufficiency of is water. China, as a country, doesn't get enough rain to supply water needs that the people in the country have. And they have insufficient water both for drinking and industrial and agricultural uses as well as other uses. But they also have insufficient water to power their hydroelectric infrastructure and generate electric power, which is causing shutdowns of industries all across China. China is in the middle of a drought, which exacerbates the problem of not having enough water, but they already were running low on water, especially clean drinkable water. Chinese water pollution is just outrageous, and it's well known, and it's a problem, and they're not able to address it. They also have an insufficient reserve of petroleum production onshore to supply their economy, and they have an insufficient supply of food production capabilities onshore. Part of that's because of water issues, and part of it's because of the productivity of the land. And so as a result, China has to import both power and food. Which brings us to the economic challenges. First, because China has no substantial internal consumption base, it means that they are vulnerable as a nation to relying upon the export of industrial goods for customers and for capital or cash inflow. Since people in China don't buy consumer goods or anything really to speak of, they save their money so that they can buy real estate, so that they can, participate in the bubble. But basically, China is reliant upon and therefore vulnerable to sell their industrial production to countries outside their borders. And additionally, they're dependent upon the sea lanes to bring them petroleum and natural gas products as well as food products, because they are unable to produce enough of the petroleum products and the food products that they need to sustain their country. So because of their dependence on imports and exports, they're extremely vulnerable, and you could say that they have a somewhat fragile economy from that perspective. Which brings us to military challenges. On the Pacific side, China has a number of both economic and historical adversaries, especially in the form of Japan. China and Japan go back a long ways as military and ideological adversaries. Economically, Japan is a powerful competitor. Of course, so is Korea. And you have Australia and a number of other countries on the Pacific side. Russia to the north and India to the south need to be addressed. Russia is buffered between China and Russia is Mongolia, and there's a little bit of direct border interaction, but for the most part right now, Russia and China have been playing nice. Now, for most of the 20th century, they had a very prickly relationship, but right now they're playing nice. It's important to note that with all this talk of Russia oil and gas being diverted from Europe to China, the reality is it isn't happening. To be able to get the production of oil and gas from Siberia to China, they've got to transport it, and there is no pipeline. Pipelines are expensive, a lot of capital required, plus they take time to build, months if not years to get built. And so the ability to produce oil and distribute it to China is limited to Russia's ability to put it on tankers. And the same is true with natural gas. And there's just not enough tankers to be able to get the production from the Siberian fields to China. And so what you're left with is a real difficult problem for Russia and China, but mostly Russia, because you can't stop the production of the oil fields without running the risk that the flow can't be easily restarted or even restarted at all. And so Russia is running into a problem that their buyers are no longer buying from them, partly because they cut them off and partly because they quit buying. And so Russia is trying to scramble and get oil and natural gas down to China, but they don't really have an efficient way of doing that. So there's no overland pipeline to Russia, and there's no overland pipeline to the Middle East, which means that all of the oil and petrochemical products that China needs to keep their country going have to come by sea, and the sea lanes are too far away from China's coast for the Navy to be able to protect, because their Navy is not a genuine blue water Navy. Now, their alliance with Russia gives them access to some degree, to the Russian blue water Navy, but Russia's Navy is not extensive and powerful enough to be able to keep the shipping lanes open on China's behalf. Sea lanes are therefore vulnerable to embargo and blockade efforts that could easily happen in the advent of a war. China's Belt and Road initiatives are also stalling out around the world, primarily because countries have learned that it's kind of like borrowing money from the local loan shark. When you can't make the payments, the loan shark comes and kneecaps you. Well, in China's case, they lend you money to build ports and to build airports, shipping ports and airports and other major infrastructure. And when you can't make the payments on the loans they've made, they come and repossess the ports and the airports. And they basically then gain access to your territory where they can put military facilities. That was their whole purpose. Well, now the world is wise to it. Of course, smart people were wise to it at the beginning. But China is running out. They have limited opportunities to gain additional port facilities for bases where they can stage their ships to protect the sea lanes. China's belligerent activity over the last decade, the building up of the Spratly Islands, the militarization of the Spratly Islands, and their increasing bellicosity and belligerence in terms of their dealings with all of their global partners, has caused a heightened awareness of the China threat. And as a result, alliances have been formed between India and China, India and Australia, the United Kingdom, Japan, Korea, and the United States, a variety of alliances specifically to counter the growing China threat. Additionally, China has essentially created an awareness so that an arms race is beginning. While China is at a relative high point in relative military power to the United States and the Western world, that's not going to last long because we've woken up, you might say, and that's going to be rectified as a problem over the next few years, a couple of decades. So China is going to see a closing window of opportunity. Now, they've created their own alliance with Russia and North Korea and Iran, and they're touting this new global order, this new world order that they're trying to assemble. The real problem is that North Korea and Iran have no significant power projection capabilities, and they have no significant industrial base, and they don't have any significant consumer base. So they don't really do China a whole lot of good. And Russia as well really can only contribute a blue water navy to the military alliance aspect. Can't really contribute much in the way of industry. You can tell that because Russia is turning to North Korea and Iran to buy military hardware. They can't produce their own military hardware to resupply from the Ukraine war losses that they've suffered. So basically, China is having to go it alone in the Eastern or the Western Pacific. So let's proceed to answer the question, why would China attack sometime in the next couple of years? So why would they attack? First of all, there's a fundamental recognition that China is entering a period of shrinking manpower. And over the next 20 years, a window is going to close in the sense that the replacement young person population that is your traditional high energy military service participant, young men of the age of 18 to 30 are the ones that are best for the military because they have the energy to be able to do all the stuff that you need, right? Well, they're going to begin to see a shrinking base of those people. And so that just lays the backdrop for a sense of urgency. Currently, their power relative to the United States and the Western world is at its highest point in terms of relative power. And they're currently sort of blessed, if you will, with a U.S. administration that is somewhat fickle and is indicating signs of weakness. Look to Afghanistan, look to how the president's mind seems to work. There's real problems there. And even though the United States, through Biden, says that the United States will protect and go to war and help the Taiwan people in the event of a war, Biden said a lot of things that he hasn't followed through on, and China knows this. China also knows that the political winds in the United States are changing, and there's a real high probability that in our midterm elections, the Republicans will take control of the Congress and maybe the Senate, and there's a real high possibility that that'll extend into the next presidential cycle. And if it does, the likelihood that an administration with a harder stance towards China than the current administration will actually come into place that will stand by Taiwan. Now, I think you can look to Iran to create some sort of a distraction. I think that there's probably a 25% probability of sometime in the 2023-2024 timeframe that China would actually launch an attack. That's my best guess. My point is that this window of opportunity that is unique and has the confluence of all these other dynamics going on is one that China may very well just say, oh, the heck with it, let's go ahead and go for Taiwan. Xi is in control, and he has removed all of the dissenters and the independent thinkers because he doesn't want anybody challenging him. It's likely he's only getting advice from people that are supporting his goal, and he has no real touchstones to the reality of the situation, a lot like Putin had when he decided to invade Ukraine. So if you see an event where either Iran or North Korea, but likely Iran, does something to draw the Pacific Fleet in the direction of the Middle East, that could be a precursor signal that something is about to happen. So what countries would support Taiwan? United States, Japan, Korea, Australia, India, maybe some NATO countries. Taiwan has a lot of trading partners. It's a democracy. It's well respected in the world. There are a lot of countries in the world that would like to see Taiwan an independent nation, and many of them would try to support Taiwan, but most would try to do so from a distance. Most nations don't have the ability to project power into the Eastern Pacific like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia and China and Japan do. So those are the countries that are most likely to get actively involved. There would be a global immediate boycott and embargo of all Chinese economic options. In other words, China would basically be shunned by the rest of the world economically. But you see this taking place in the Ukraine. The embargoes that are happening to Russia because of its invasion have been going on for about 6 months now, the boycotts and embargoes, and they're just now beginning to have any real noticeable impact. So they would not be immediately helpful to Taiwan. So how would China attack Taiwan? Well, I think you would see a progressive series of military feints and progressively larger military training and exercises by the Chinese in the China Sea, the straits between China and Taiwan. And it would get to the point where on a daily basis there were incursions and it would get to the point where Taiwan and the rest of the world wouldn't really know when the real event was going to happen, and until suddenly they went ahead and started attacking. Look for a buildup of forces along the Chinese coast. And then look for North Korea and Iran to start being mischievous to attract attention and draw the U.S. Sixth Fleet away from the East China Sea. China would almost certainly try to trick Taiwan into firing the first shot so that they could have the pretense of needing to attack as a defensive measure and then just carrying it on. So would an attack lead to a nuclear exchange? Well, it's always possible. Anything can happen in the fog of war. Sinking a U.S. aircraft carrier is probably the single biggest concern. That's billions of dollars of equipment and 5,000 lives potentially that could be lost. The United States would be horrified and be angry to an extreme that happened, and might result or end up using theater nuclear weapons as a result. So the question kind of becomes, how desperate would China be to not lose the war? I think they'd be very desperate to not lose the war, because if they lost the war, it would pretty much signal an unequivocal need for a regime change in China. So if China attacks Taiwan, what will be the impact on world trade? Well, it'd be massively disruptive, to say the least. If Taiwan survives, it would become an independent country with UN representation. The real question is the degree to which the United States and China would directly engage with kinetic weapons and what the level of damage with the forces involved would be. Let's presume that China doesn't attack within 2 years. What happens then? Does China expand or decline economically? Well, most likely there'd be a slowing of the rate of growth, and their rate of growth could stagnate or even decline. It would really depend largely upon what the Western world decides to do in regards to buying things from China. If the Western world decides to take the China threat seriously and as rapidly as possible disengage from China so that it doesn't support China's economy by purchasing products, then China will likely decline significantly and rapidly. What about China's sphere of influence? What would happen there? Well, it's kind of the same, like the economy. The sphere of influence would be determined a lot by how the Western nations would react. Now, China certainly could cut attractive deals with many nations in the area, but when you're Malaysia or Thailand or one of the other countries that China would approach, Indonesia, the Philippines, and they're wanting to do business with these countries, who would you rather do business with if you were one of those countries? The wealthy West or China, who is becoming rapidly a pariah on the global stage? So if the West is coordinated in how they deal with China, then absolutely China's sphere of influence declines. Well, the question of can China get a handle on its economic troubles is an interesting one. The biggest question is, can China confront its population decline, the collapse that's occurring there? And if China can come up with a plan that really works, they potentially could reverse the population decline, but think about what that means. That means that they have to generate as quickly as possible among families in the 20 to 40 or so year age range, a nationalistic fervor of growing their families to 3, 4, or maybe even 5 children. And how do you do that when it's not in the best interest of most families economically to do that? Well, you have to compensate them economically somehow. That's a huge task for a nation to undertake because of all the costs that kids have. And so if China's trying to add 100 or 200 million new kids into their economy over the course of 10 or 20 years, and they're supporting all these families, that's an economic drain on China, the likes of which no nation has ever experienced. And even if they did that, it would be at least a generation or two, probably 2 generations before the impact on the productive cohort in the population tree would really begin to take place. So that's not an immediate fix to China's economic problems. In the meantime, there's a real high likelihood that social upheaval will continue and become more prevalent. So when does the population collapse begin to noticeably impact China's global stature? Well, I think it's already happening now. It's causing China to take actions that are less than optimal from a long-term perspective. Over the last 10 to 20 years, we've seen a gradual increase in China's approach to military and diplomatic relations. They've done the Spratly Islands expansion. They've become more belligerent in their dealings with the Western world. They see war coming. They know it's coming. And they're in the process of preparing their population psychologically for it. So it's happening now. And over the next 20 to 40 years, there will be significant difficulty as China's productive population ages towards retirement. This is going to put a lot of stress on their social interactions and on their political system. So how does a country deal with an increasing level of internal stress? Can you say Western devils? Pointing people's attention to an enemy outside the country is an easy way to leverage nationalistic tendencies. So let's presume that China doesn't attack and that it begins to shrink. So what happens to the CCP? That's the $100 trillion question, isn't it? So if the Chinese Communist Party chooses to pick a fight, the cost will be too large to reasonably calculate. It will decimate the world's economy, and who knows what could happen. If the Chinese Communist Party decides that they want to be a change agent, which means that maybe they want to drive some sort of a new change in their party, which would probably require that they got rid of Xi Jinping and whoever is really his supporters, and they led a new revolution, a revolution towards a democracy or some other form of government that is not as antagonistic towards the West, then very likely the Chinese people would get behind it. Maybe they would look forward to a pivot towards democracy. So many Chinese people have been in the Western world for education. They know that alternatives exist. And even though their freedom of thought and expression is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, that doesn't mean that they don't have an experience that could be useful in helping to lead the country to a resurgence of vitality. So it is possible that the Chinese Communist Party could throw out the old guard, in this case Xi Jinping and his cohort, and then lead a revolution and do a pivot towards a more acceptable world position. Power abhors a vacuum, and the leaders of the Communist Chinese Party, they know what is coming at them, and all they have to do is decide to get in front of it by making a change and create a new revolution. It's something that they're well capable of doing. So what are we to do? Well, prepare. First, we need to arm Taiwan in advance. We're not going to have the ability to do what we did in the Ukraine and arm them after the fact, because getting arms onto an island nation that close to China with a military force that they have will be a tricky situation at best. We need to make Taiwan a powerful porcupine. We need to build up our Pacific fleet. We need to add ships, and we need to add more modernized weapons. We need to make our lethality even greater. We need to build up our Pacific alliances. We need to prepare and train for the worst. And as a business, if you have a business, you need to do a deep dive into your supply chain. Imagine not only your supply chain, but all of your parts, like an alternator. You've seen exploded diagrams of alternators showing the nuts and the bolts and the wiring and all the different pieces that make an alternator. Every one of the products in your supply chain, you need to look at it and you need to blow it up, and you need to look at where all these parts come from, because that product may be assembled in Taiwan, but parts come from China. Or it may be assembled in China and parts come from Taiwan or Malaysia or Thailand. So you need to understand where all the sourcing for all of your component parts of all your components. So the components of your components for your products. And then you need to onshore or on-continent those sourcings. You need to make sure that those sourcings are made from countries that can be depended upon in the event of a war between Taiwan and China. And that means basically get started now to get that resourcing happening. All right, this has been a lot, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked it, please like it. Please subscribe to my channel, ring the bell, and of course, leave me a comment. Even if you agree or disagree, I don't really care. I'd love to hear your comments. Tell me what you think. And I look forward to the next video that I put up, which will be very soon. Thank you for watching.